everyone coming in for the final trait track session. This has been, it is absolutely the best conference I've ever attended, virtual and in person, and no shame in my game. I'll stand by it. And I could possibly be a little biased because we get to participate as the host of the trait track, but even that aside, the effort that is put forth to educate and be inclusive and all the fun and creative activities is absolutely amazing. And I am so delighted to give this talk about life action and hydrating for our sickle cell trait warriors. We will start shortly. I still see people coming in. So hopefully you've made some new friends, got to participate in some meetups, ask some questions, and position yourself to win some of these awesome prizes, just completely unmatched, totally unmatched. It's 1:03, we'll give it another few minutes, letting people join us on this final trait track session, but the conference is by far not over. There's a host of events going on today, later this evening, and even convening tomorrow with the official prizes being awarded tomorrow afternoon. So don't miss. I don't know if you have to be present to win, but it's so fun, super exciting to experience. Hi, Miss Ritchie says good afternoon to everyone. Miss Ritchie. Mwape, all the way from the UK. She's been with us every single day. What a trooper. What a trooper. Okay, so 104, let's just go ahead and jump right in. I am Dr. Tamia Austin. I am a proud sickle cell ally. I have been in this space since 2010, and that is in the sickle cell trait space. And I found my life's passion when joining the As One Foundation as the director. We have been welcomed with open arms by the Sickle Cell Community Consortium to host the trait track. And this is the third of 3 trait track sessions this year, Life Action Hydrate. Our first speaker is a trait warrior himself, Ferran Dozier. So we will hand the floor over to Ferran to introduce himself and give us the life part of our talk today.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. Glad to be able to support this conference yet another year. And actually, I'm honored to be able to do the life part of this conversation because this is very important to me, as is my personal story, but it is my life after military. So I have a lot of meanings that I could give to this conversation, but I want to start with just my presentation, if I can get this thing to, I want to act right now. All right, we want to do that today, huh?
Oh, you're trying to make it bigger.
Yeah, I'm trying to make it play. Oh, there it goes. Okay, here we go.
Here we go.
All right, so I'm going to give you just the basic facts about sickle cell trait. I call it what's so with sickle cell trait, known as SCT, also the hemoglobin AS. When I talk about life, this is out of, like I said, my transition out of the military. I saw that my share of my experience with sickle cell trait exertion and the missing conversations in the world, that I found a place, I found my voice. So if you're out there living with this inherited gene, believe me that we need your voice to share with us in this conversation as we alter some of these old dialogues about sickle cell trait. Those are the basic facts that I'll be talking to you about. It can be found on the CDC website. This is what hemoglobin, if you're not familiar with that. It's found in the red blood cells, carries oxygen from the lungs into the tissues and organs. That's me at the bottom. I have one normal and one that is mutates. They said sickle cell trait has a purpose in life, combats malaria. If you're not familiar with malaria, parasites, they attack the red blood cells. And so they say that that defective gene is how that race started to survive sickle cell. I mean, survive malaria. A lot of people today think it's still African Americans only. We are number one. However, you can be Caucasian, Mediterranean, European, Asian descent. So it's no longer just a color, it is a bloodline. So you have to know where your ancestors are from and be tested. How it's inherited. If both parents have
log in. All right, she got attitude.
If both parents have sickle cell trait, there's a 50% chance that your child would have sickle cell trait and a 25% chance that your child could be born with sickle cell anemia or normal. And that's me at the bottom. If one parent has sickle cell trait, there's a 50% chance. So I have 3 daughters. My youngest daughter, Deja, she inherited the gene from me. I got it from my dad, rest in peace. And so my grandson does not have the sickle cell trait. So right now the buck stops with my daughter. They say 300 million people globally have sickle cell trait. These numbers are old. So, but this is what they give us. United States, they say somewhere between 2.5 to 3 to 4 million have sickle cell trait. And this is what it looks like with each pregnancy. These statistics happen over. So it's not, you can have one child with AA and one with AS and one with SS. You can, but with each pregnancy, these start over. So I've met people that have, multiple children with sickle cell SS. And some people think it skips generation. It does not skip generations. And just like your complexion, your hair texture, your facial features, your eye colors, we don't get to pick. Your parents did not get to pick what color eyes you have. And so just like that, that's how that inherited gene is passed on. This is where it gets personal. These are the risk factors of sickle cell trait. This is out of the medical community. Most people with sickle cell trait do not have any symptoms of sickle cell disease. For me, this next word, although in rare cases, people with sickle cell trait might experience complications of sickle cell disease, such as pain crisis in their extreme forms. I can tell you that my mom will say at age 2 that I would wake up out of my sleep with arm aches, my left arm. I remember being age 5, my grandmother hold me over the sink, run warm water over my arm. Only thing would soothe the pain in my arm. Took me to the doctor in 1975, said it was growing pains. I'm 51 now, and I still have that same arm pain. They say scuba diving is not a good sport for us with sickle cell trait because of the oxygen levels, and also places like Denver, Colorado, Cheyenne, Wyoming, where the oxygen level is thin. People have had some complications with their trait, and also in military boot camps and athletic competitions, as you've heard, if you've been following along the trait track. It shows up like dehydration. That's what they thought I had, dehydration, heat stroke. However, it was not just the rhabdomyolysis. 5 years later, I discovered it was something called exertional sickling with rhabdo. And so, of course, more research is needed to find out why some of us with sickle cell trait have complications and others do not. Again, just to let you know, some people with sickle cell trait have been shown to be more likely So there's that heat stroke, that muscle breakdown. That's the rhabdomyolysis that people have actually passed away, or was the trigger to their death. Somebody got some feedback back there. If you can mute yourself, please. And so it doesn't make, you a less athlete or less soldier. It just means that you need to be able to sometimes set your own pace and build up your intensity slowly. Rest in between repetitive sets and drills. Drink plenty of water before, during, after training conditions and active conditioning activities. Keep your body temperature cool. And again, if you are with someone or you see someone experiencing these severe muscle fatigues or dehydration, sometimes they may need more than just some bottled water. They may need some medical attention. As a sickle cell trait advocate, it is very important that we make sure that we talk about not just sickle cell trait, but there are other red blood cell conditions out there like hemoglobin C trait, thalassemia trait, D trait, E trait, OARAB, Monroe. There's hundreds of different red blood cell conditions. So if you have sickle cell trait and you're aware of your status, make sure that you take your partner, or not just ask your partner, but do the hemoglobin electrophoresis test, which I'm going to show you in a second, to make sure that you're aware, because some people have had children in our community that did not know that their partner had another type of red blood cell condition. And we have our lovely warriors who have sickle cell SC disease or sickle cell beta thalassemia, and so on. So it's very important, if you know your status or your child has the inherited gene, to teach them early on and to remind them that they are sickle cell trait carriers and that there are risk factors, but also the importance of knowing their status and their partner status as well. And that's the hemoglobin electrophoresis. I call it where they shock the blood, and how they determine your type of, I got carried away, is how those proteins mutate. And so how those proteins mutate is how they can determine what type of inherited gene that you have. What I want you to walk away with today is that, again, know your status, your sickle cell trait status, thalassemia, hemoglobin C, D, E. With sickle cell trait exertion, sometimes asthma is connected with the cardiac arrest. Very important. Acute illness. I met people with sickle cell who experienced sickle cell trait exertion who knew that they had a cold that day, but they still went out to exercise and do that fitness test. And the one gentleman knew he had it in the Air Force, had taken that test before with a cold. So it was just another regular morning with him. He ended up having the rhabdo with sickle cell trait, and literally was in the hospital for months, had to learn how to walk again, on dialysis. So sometimes they say you can sweat out a cold. Always not necessarily the truth. Some people that I meet with sickle cell trait may not have pains and crisis, but we talk about fatigue. Fatigue seems to be very high up on the list of sickle cell trait experiences. So fatigue and dehydration, muscle weakness, you got to be aware of that. Of course, our diet is number one, and hydration, and what you eat. Medications, anyone can experience rhabdomyolysis, not just sickle cell trait carriers. And so there are some medications that can trigger rhabdo, statin drugs like cholesterol medications and things like that, that can cause a person to have exertion. Your medical examinations, of course, if you have sickle cell trait or your children, make sure, even before you start working out, a lot of people just get off the couch and go straight to the gym. Make sure you go get a physical. Make sure you detox. Sometimes we need to clean out those toxins in our bodies before we exercise, because they will get released into your system once you start exercising. So sometimes it's important to even detox. As you know, the NCAA has made it mandatory for all student athletes to have a sickle cell trait test done. I agree with that. However, there are other red blood cell conditions that can cause exertional sickening as well. I've met people with thalassemia trait, C trait, who have had issues exercising as well with sports. But I do appreciate that they have talked about sickle cell trait, but all red blood cell conditions need to be aware that you can have some type of risk factors with those genes. That is it for my life part of this conversation. Again, if you are out there and you want to share your story with me, I have a radio show. You can find me at wdc.sct.org, and I will be around for the questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Farhan. Our military trait warrior, retired Army first class, retired first class.
Sergeant first class.
Sergeant first class, U.S. Army trait warrior. Thank you for sharing that part of your story. We're gonna jump right into my presentation, so share. Okay. It's so much up here on my screen, I can't see where to make it big. Okay, there we go. Is it big?
Not yet. There it goes.
Okay. All right. So Life Action Hydrate is what we're talking about today. And so the As One Foundation is the organization that I represent. It was founded by this gentleman holding the football, DeVar Darling. Our current mission is to empower families globally, delivering life-saving sickle cell education. And the As One Foundation does start with tragedy. These young men were born in Nassau, Bahamas. They were a surprise to their parents and doctor. They were expecting one child, but two baby boys were born. And they had been hearing two hearts beating as one. So fast forward to 2001, when they were at Florida State playing football, that's where they learned they had the sickle cell trait. During their pre-participation physical, they were advised that sickle cell trait was benign, asymptomatic, nothing to worry about, you live a normal life, and just be careful with who you have a baby with to avoid the 25% chance of having a child with sickle cell disease. And they went on their way. They had a very successful year as freshmen, playing, almost winning every game that season. They fell short of the national championship game. So when they came back that following spring, they were out to prove that they could go hard, they would win. They, had that appetite for winning. And unfortunately, February 26, 2001, they had the perfect storm of Devon being coached, your body is amazing, you'll pass out before you die. And Devon actually passed out multiple times and did die that day. And DeVar would live, especially those immediate days, trying to understand what happened, what was this sickle cell trait, why did he live? Why did Devon pass? He wished they could have switched places and all of that, but divine intervention would have it that DeVar would live and go on and make it to the National Football League, to establish the As One Foundation, to answer a lot of the questions that he had after losing his brother. We're at this conference, everyone's well aware of what this is, what sickle cell trait is. But when I'm out in the community, believe it or not, a lot of people still don't get that there is a difference between trait and disease. So I won't belabor this point here. And as well as who can be affected by it. This is not just an African-American condition, it's a blood condition. But here's some fun. So we've heard Farhan's perspective, his story. We've heard our two prior sessions, if you were here. I need to figure out how to move this over so I can see my slide. Okay, there we go. 3 protective factors, especially for sickle cell trait warriors who engage in physical activity or exert. If you want to guess, and I'm trying to get to where I can see the chat because I'm on full screen. but, or maybe you could just unmute and tell me what you think it is. 3 protective factors, especially for sickle cell trait warriors who engage in physical activity or exert. I cannot see the chat, I guess because I'm sharing. So I'll just go and
I can
move
see the
ahead.
chat for you, Tamia, if you'd like.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I went ahead and gave that one away. So this one is warm up, drink up, rest up. What do we mean by warm up, drink up, rest up? It means that in physical activity, and this of course is not just reserved for our athletes, our trait warrior athletes. This is reserved for any of our warriors, caregivers, trait warriors that are doing any physical activity, working physically laborious jobs, dancers, people that are taking care of a bucket list and running their first marathon, or pledging a sorority or fraternity, and there is physical activity going on there. Increase to intensity gradually. That's what warm up means. You do not jump on that treadmill and go hard all out. Get on that field and do some warm up exercises, stretch. You're not running for 45 minutes straight without any buildup. That's what warm up means. And drink up, pretty obvious. But what's not so obvious is that hydration is to be done before, during, and after. Before, during, and after physical activity. And we recommend that the consumption is at least half your body weight in ounces. Half your body weight in ounces of water per day is what is recommended to avoid dehydration. This is the second protective factor. And finally, rest up. Rest up is recovery. And a lot we do hear pro athletes that have sickle cell trait say to us that I've often wondered why I'm sitting in the locker room and my teammates have gone on home or whatever, and I'm still trying to recover. I'm still not able to get my breath. That's why this rest up is important. You see people raise their hands above their hands or above their head, or take a knee, or put their hands on their hips. That is an example of rest up. These are 3 protective factors for people with sickle cell trait, especially those that engage in physical activity. 3 risk factors when living with sickle cell trait. Let's throw some ideas in the chat. I kind of gave you some hints with the protective factors. 3 risk factors when living with sickle cell trait. You heard Farhan speak today. We've talked about this in the 2 prior sessions. 3 risk factors when living with sickle cell trait. Who's my helper? Do we have any?
I'm here, Janine.
Janine, do we have any guesses in the chat?
I'm looking. I don't see any.
Okay, well, I only have 15 minutes, so I'm just going to keep going.
Yeah.
Dehydration, elevation, and exertion. And Farhan did touch on these. Dehydration is pretty obvious. That is, not, and I believe I have a slide that shows that we water our plants, we put water in our cars, we feed our pets water to avoid them getting lethargic, to avoid our cars getting overheated, to avoid our plants from dying. But in order for a human to not be dehydrated, we are to consume half our body weight in ounces of water per day. That's for everyone. And especially if you have sickle cell and sickle cell trait. And in some instances, the recommendation is for even more hydration than that. That is to avoid dehydration. That's a #1 risk factor for those that have sickle cell trait and exert. And we're not in any way saying avoid exertion. Elevation, that is when we heard Farhan talk about deep sea diving, flying, mountain climbing. Changes in oxygen level, elevation can change your ability or access to oxygen. So that is a risk factor. It is not saying you can't fly, but these are, you know, I hear people say, before I fly, I make sure my hydration is good. And there's other things that they do, like wearing compression socks and things like that. And then finally, exertion. And a lot of these, well, actually, in all of these athlete deaths, because sickle cell trait is classified as the top non-injury killer of student athletes, exertion was key. But the exertion was not, the warm up, drink up, rest up was not in place. They were not mandated to go from rest to intensity gradually. They just went in and went hard. And most of these deaths actually occurred on the first day of practice within the first hour. This information is important for us to know. Recommended daily water consumption amount to avoid dehydration. I just totally gave you that answer. Half your body weight in ounces. So if you weigh 200 pounds, you should be consuming 100 ounces of water per day. If you weigh 150 pounds, then you should be consuming 75 ounces of water a day. Happens with blood flow to the spleen. I'm sorry, happens when, I should say, is blocked due to oxygen shortage that causes tissue death. And this is something that does affect people that have sickle cell trait as well as people that don't have sickle cell trait. And that is a condition that Devon suffered with. Devard as the living twin, but in the NFL, and even since retiring, he suffered with this. Ferran has, you know what, my apologies. This is splenic infarction. This is something that can happen when trait warriors fly. Term for this is the one that has affected Ferran and Devon and others. The breakdown of muscle tissue in the bloodstream resulting from overtraining has proven fatal for those with sickle cell trait athletes. And again, this can be experienced by those that have sickle cell, that don't have sickle cell trait, and that is rhabdomyolysis. Again, it is the top non-killer, non-injury killer of sickle cell, of collegiate athletes. And these are just 3 examples of, unfortunately, hundreds of young people that have lost their life in college playing collegiate athletics. And Shanice is, you know, a female. So, and I point that out because I've been asked, is this something that just happens to males? No, it is not. And Ferran did go over some of the background with the NCAA mandate, which is, by the way, it is working, but the deaths continue. So we know that education and more education is needed, because now we're having high schoolers pass away. These are high schoolers, girls, boys, and even Carson Cross, the young white fella on the end. Carson died on the first day of football practice. Within the first, well, he actually collapsed on the first day of football practice. He later passed away at the hospital. His dad was actually an EMT, or is an EMT, and they knew that he had sickle cell trait. They did not know that trait could be fatal. They did not know that trait could be symptomatic. And this is why we take the time to educate. This is just the slide about what I was saying with the protective factors: gradual intensity and work up to intensity, hydrate before, during, and after, and recovery breaks. What didn't happen at that Florida State football conditioning workout that caused Devon to pass out and die is that they were not allowed recovery breaks. The unwritten rule, water was kicked out of practice. And if one man failed, the whole team failed. His teammates were carrying him through the drills as his body failed him. Your body failing you is a clue. So listen, and parents of young warriors, young trait warriors, listen. The overarching message: warm up, drink up, rest up. Parents, make sure your coaches, your kids' coaches, even you as parents of warriors. I've had a 48-year-old woman tell me that her mother came to her and apologized to her because she thought while raising her that she was just lazy, that she was just a hypochondriac, But chronic fatigue is a symptom of sickle cell trait. And often we had Sydney tell us on the first day that she just couldn't understand why she couldn't perform and why she, couldn't bring forth what her coaches were trying to bring out of her. Well, the sickle cell trait was part of that. What we need, though, is more testing in high school. We need surveillance, better surveillance, because as we know, our numbers, our surveillance is wonky. It's not accurate. We believe honestly, I believe there are more trait warriors than what we currently know. And certainly research and funding for research will help us get there. We've talked about this, the dehydration, elevation, exertion, and we did speak about the renal medullary carcinoma yesterday as a kidney, kidney connection of sickle cell trait with the kidney. Now, I just bring this up because this is where I believe our work is. In the United States, we do have universal screening, and not in every state, but most states, parents are notified by letter that their child has sickle cell trait. And that letter is usually very short, bulleted. It's not the disease. Your kid will live a normal life. Just they're given some family planning advice and told nothing to worry about, with very little to no follow-up. And this is where we really can be impactful, because we need to discuss this more. Parents need to know more. I know too many parents that didn't even know they had sickle cell trait until their child was born with sickle cell disease. This is not in any implication of a sickle cell disease birth. It is a question for awareness, for informed, being able to make an informed decision. And then once that child is here, what do they know about their sickle cell trait? That right now the conversation is only at diagnosis and if they play an NCAA sport. And we need to have more opportunities for that conversation throughout life. Again, this is a genetics issue. This is a bloodline issue, not a skin color issue. Of course, we've talked about some of the myths that are associated. It's benign, it's asymptomatic, nothing to worry about. But we also conducted some research that did assess whether or not stigma was experienced by other student athletes wanting to share or know whether or not their teammates had sickle cell trait and would it hurt them. And the research proved interesting. This is the name of that study: Social Ecological Examination of Sickle Cell Trait, Knowledge, Perceptions, and Beliefs Amongst Coaches, Trainers, Student Athletes, and Their Parents at a Florida HBCU. We went through a host of questions. We did a mixed method study with survey and focus groups. And one of the things we did find, which we'll have a slide that examines, is that these young people do want to be tested, they want to be educated, and they believe the education should be universally provided. Everyone on campus, they should have been educated about it in high school, and everyone should be tested. Everyone should be made aware, and my reigning example is every October, the world turns pink. We have enough terrain and territory in the sickle community for at least 1 month that the whole world turns burgundy. Everyone should be educated about sickle cell, even though every one of us is not going to experience sickle cell or sickle cell trait. All of us know, and that is the job of the ally. We need people that are not physically affected to care, to help us move the needle, to help make sickle cell popular, as our good friend out in Vegas, to help make sickle cell sexy. It's an empowerment thing. I had a conversation with a warrior who was a wrestler in college. Sickle cell disease, as it said, full-blown sickle cell disease in college. She was a wrestler because she was able to assess the amount of rest that she would need, the amount of hydration that she would need, the amount of, taking good care of herself that she would have to demonstrate for her parents to allow her to be a wrestler, and she was. So it is a superpower, and I've heard it expressed to me in that way. And that's all we want to do, is to identify this, not stigmatize it, but identify it and prepare our young people to know what their superpower is and to be able to use it. This slide is only, is just demonstrating what happens when exertional sickling takes place, and how sometimes it can look like other things like cramping. But there's athletic trainers that are trained to know what the symptoms are, to know what they're seeing on a football field or a basketball court. But we need the entire staff to be aware and not place a judgment on whether or not a kid is being lazy or a kid is acting out or claiming to be special because they need hydration. As the discussion, bottom line of that study was that the education is desired. They not only desire the education, but they feel testing should be available to all. They express no threat of stigma, and we also need the care and concern of non-infected allies. This is one resource that the As One Foundation provides to sickle cell trait parents. It's a sickle cell trait parents guide. You can go to our website and download that resource for free. Our parents take them to the football and sports practices as a tool to show their coach that, hey, my kid cannot be deprived of hydration. My kid needs to warm up. My kid needs to have multiple recovery breaks. And this resource is sort of, something that arms them to get that assistance from the coach, the buy-in. And back to the ally conversation, all humans have a genotype. My genotype is AA. What is yours? Find out, get tested. You may be surprised. And one of the other things that has come up quite a bit is that we have quite a few sickle cell trait warriors that, or at least they believe they're sickle cell trait, but are actually sickle cell disease because of and Dr. I'm not going to get into that. I'm a PhD. Dr. Maisha is the MD. So maybe that can be Dr. Maisha's first question when she joins us. So I'm going to stop sharing and get back over here so I can see if there are any questions. I see some amens. Forget the right name. It's not sickling, it's tissue instead. Okay, I don't know what that one's about. But as Dr. Maisha joins us, do we have any more questions and comments about what we've presented so far? Or Dr. Maisha, do you want to jump right in on that last issue I brought up?
Repeat for me the one you're talking about.
Okay, I'm gonna look at my slide again. The genotype, and we at least we know of one young lady that has been diagnosed as sickle cell trait, but you actually said she doesn't have.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and that's a lot. That's happening a lot. We have people that have multiple traits, but because of that blood count that you identified, that is actually disease. So you take it away from there.
Okay, so I don't know if I can find my slides on this, but basically what I explain is that compound heterozygosity is homozygosity. So basically whenever you have two different traits, then those two traits combine together to basically give you the same picture as having the disease. So one young lady that presented, she said that I have sickle cell trait. And then she proceeded to say, I am S and beta thal. Beta thalassemia means that your blood cells are not functioning properly. And sickle cell trait means that your blood cells are not functioning properly. So that means that she's only has defective genes. So even with two defective genes, some of your red blood cells will be okay. But the more you have defective, the more number of defective genes that you have. If you have one, then you're going to have a certain amount of defective blood cells. And if you have two, then you're going to have that much more. You're going to have double, right? So let's say if you're SS, a lot of people with SS are 70 to 80% sickled cells, and maybe only 10 to 30% if they're lucky, normally functioning red blood cells, because we're talking genotype and phenotype, right? So the genotype is what programs your body's actual proteins and fat and bone and everything else comes from your genotype. So just because you have something in your genes doesn't mean it absolutely has to be expressed 100% of the time in that way. But it does mean that the more defective genes you have, the more defective results you're going to have in the production. So basically, when you have sickle cell trait, you have S sickle cells, right? And in trait, a lot of times your cells are stiffer and stickier, because this is where it gets really confusing, and we have a lecture about it. But basically, your hemoglobin, there are 270 million hemoglobin molecules in each red blood cell. So that's why you can have some red blood cells that kind of function normally, right? Because the phenotype is programming those abnormal hemoglobins, but not all of them are going to come out completely abnormal once they get into that red blood cell. So in trait, your cells are stiffer and stickier. In beta thal, your cells are smaller. And so basically, you don't have any cells that are functioning, any hemoglobin that's functioning properly. So when all that goes in to make up your red blood cell, it's going to be very hard for your red blood cells to function properly. And so that's the issue there with, it's kind of hard to understand, but then again, basically it means you're the same as someone who has SS, essentially. Maybe not exactly as bad all the time, but all of these have overlaps. We can't say that just because you're SS is, that you're going to be sick every day of the year. You may have mostly good days. You may only have crisis once a year. You can have trait and have crisis 10 times a year, because there's all these other factors that interact with your health to constitute what's going to actually happen to you. And that's why we can't say that, just because you're this or that, well, now we need to exclude you or stigmatize you. Each person needs to be treated according to what they can do and they can handle. And that's why I really like where you said, we're not going to stigmatize people. We want awareness and give people a better chance. I do have this particular slide that I wanted to share.
Dr.
which
Maisha,
can help your, yes?
can you touch on the A2 percentage? Because that's what triggered that conversation with the young lady, was her A2 numbers.
Yeah, so we're on the same page. Do you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so let me see. I don't think I have the pheresis on here, but this is the labs that your doctors can look at and can help you understand better why it can be very confusing. So I'm going to just talk about the A2 very briefly. When you do the hemoglobin electrophoresis, and I have that in a different slide deck, but when you do the hemoglobin electrophoresis, you are assessing the actual result, right? So that's not your genes, it's the result of what your genes are producing. So that's the phenotype. So your hemoglobin electrophoresis is going to say, because you would say, why isn't it 50-50, right? If I'm SAS, I have an A gene and an S gene. Why isn't it that 50% of my blood is sickle and then 50% is normal hemoglobin? It doesn't come out like that. It's not a 1-to-1. So then basically, if you're AS, typically you're going to be from 38 to 42% red blood cell proteins that are sickle. And then you're going to have, hopefully, if you're lucky, a little bit of fetal hemoglobin, which is like anywhere from 0 to 3%. And then the rest will be A. Or you're going to, and A and A2. Normal amount of A2 is 2.1 to 3.2. Okay. So 2.1 to 3.2 is normal, A2. A2 is looking at your alpha and beta chains a little more. It's really looking at your alpha chains. saying how many alpha chains are you making? Because you're making alpha and beta. It's complicated. So when you have high A2, like 4.2, as we had in the young lady yesterday, that means you have a lot of alpha chains, but you shouldn't have that many alpha chains. You shouldn't have more than 3.4. But when the body can't make beta chains, so you either have beta minor or beta naught, then it's going to make alpha chains instead in order to compensate for the lack of beta chains. So now your red blood cell, instead of being made up each individual molecule of 2 alphas and 2 betas, which is what's normal, maybe it'll be 4 alphas or 3 alphas and 1 beta. That can't function fully normally. It still functions, but not fully normally. And that means that person's going to be very sick or could be very sick.
Is there a scientific explanation for the chronic fatigue? We do have a comment about someone saying, now I get it. I have sickle cell trait and I'm constantly fatigued. Can you explain that scientifically, Dr. Pasante?
Absolutely. Okay, so there's a difference between chronic fatigue syndrome, which is a wastebasket diagnosis of exclusion. You could have vitamin deficiency that's gone undiagnosed and have chronic fatigue. You could have, it's all kinds of things that end up causing chronic fatigue. You could have undiagnosed depression and they get thrown into the wastebasket of chronic fatigue. But with sickle cell and sickle cell trait, you are not carrying your oxygen to full capacity. It is not getting to the tissues. If you think about the plane, when you take a plane ride, they turn the oxygen down at some point. And if you notice, if you take any long plane ride, at some point, the whole plane is asleep. And that's because there's not enough oxygen. You need oxygen to be pumped, to stay awake, to be active and moving and doing. You have to breathe. That's why when you do exercise and sports, you breathe even more because oxygen is basically what's giving your cells the energy to function. Well, when you have sickle cell trait, you're not getting the oxygen. So it's not really chronic fatigue syndrome, it's fatigue because of sickle cell trait. That is one of the complications of it. It's no different than any other anemia where you're just not getting enough oxygen to where it needs to go because your blood's not functioning properly. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Thank you for that. Another question, do newborn screenings test for all these? This might have been when you were talking about the various.
Yes, it
genes.
does. It does, but most of the time, nobody knows what everything means. So, for example, I give this case report where I found alpha thalassemia minor in a patient because her A2 was low. So in alpha thalassemia, you're missing your alpha chains. And that's why we call it alpha thalassemia, because you're missing your alpha chains to more or lesser degrees. There's 4 grades of it, and there's 4 grades of beta. And so her A2 was very low. It was 1.5. And as I told you, it should be 2.2, something like that. And so instead, it was like 1.5, 1.3. So she didn't have enough alpha chain. So what's happening here? Well, that's alpha thalassemia. So your doctor or whoever gets that test will see this low A2 and be like, I don't know what this means. You don't know what it means. Nobody knows what it means. Nobody looks into it, And in this lady's case, she kept getting iron, 3 times a day iron, and not getting better. And that is a hallmark of alpha thalassemia and beta thalassemia. Iron isn't helping you. You have abnormal. So this is where this slide comes into play. So I really should make it on a presenter view, I think. Okay, so on this slide, is it big now?
Yes.
Okay, so on these slides here, let me see. Now I went too far. That's my ode to Dr. Tamia slide. Okay. Where did it go? I had it and now it's gone. Basically, your red blood cell indices, I can kind of use this. I don't know if I can use this. When you get your lab work done by your doctor, it's going to have hemoglobin and hematocrit. Oh, yeah, it's this one. Okay. So it's going to have hemoglobin and hematocrit. And a lot of times in trait, those are going to be completely normal. because you're going to have a normal amount of hemoglobin and maybe even a normal concentration of hemoglobin. The hemoglobin you have is dysfunctional. And the only way we start to find that out is something called the concentration, your mean corpuscular concentration, and your mean corpuscular volume. This means how well those red blood cells are concentrated with hemoglobin and how well the corpuscles have enough volume in each red blood cell. And then RDW means the number of tiny cells and the number of big cells. It shouldn't be high. It should be a normal amount. When you have sickle cell trait or any of these sickle hemoglobinopathies, you're going to have lots of small ones and maybe some big ones, but they're not going to be a normal distribution of normal ones. And so this may be the only clue that it's quite normal to do a CBC when someone says they're tired, because you start looking for anemia. Well, they'll say, oh, you're fine, you're not anemic, your hemoglobin macros are normal, but these will not be normal a lot of times. And so with the alpha thalassemia and the beta thalassemia, this is also where you can catch it, as well as your platelets. So those things may all be abnormal, but they're small, little tiny abnormalities. And then these might even be normal. But what you do is you compare when the patient feels good to when the patient feels bad, and you'll see a significant or relative change in these numbers for that individual patient. And so those are the things that can help your doctor get a clue. But on the newborn screening, it tests for tons of genetic diseases like phenylketonuria, which I can remember the last time I saw that, PKU it's called. It tests for, I think it does CF, it does several things, but no one's paying attention, and that's part of the problem. But it's not going to tell you alpha thalassemia, beta thalassemia, sickle cell trait in a clear way most of the time, especially with alpha and beta. Those are going to get missed. So they'll tell you S trait because we've done so much advocacy. They'll tell you, okay, your child has sickle cell trait, but they won't make you realize that they have sickle beta thal or sickle alpha thal. You're like, okay, well, you told me trait's benign, but my kid's sick all the time. What's going on? Well, they have two problems, not one. And that's the difference.
Okay, Dr. Basante, we actually have a hand raised, and I'll just say we have less than 8 minutes before we have to move. So I'm going to ask Ms. Vivian to unmute and ask your question.
But this was a comment. I talked to a researcher who did research on infant being newborn testing. At the time, this was like 3 or 4 years ago. She said there were 50 different disorders that are picked up in a newborn screening. And that was at least 3 or 4 years ago. And each year things increase and are seen on a daily basis. Every year medicine changes.
Every year.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's what I'm trying to get across. That you said it perfectly. Exactly.
With our talk today, Life Action Hydrate, I think of our caregivers, and it's not said enough that every warrior parent, every child of that sickle cell parent will be at least trait. What, as we close, what message do you have to our caregivers about their children with trait within this topic of Life Action Hydrate that we can leave them with on this final trait track session?
I would like to say that when you have a child with sickle cell disease, that means you both have trait. Most of the time, there are some rare cases of mosaicism where you have only one person with trait and you get the child with the disease, genetic mosaicism. But basically, you don't need to feel guilty that you're sick too. And you need to take care of yourself like you're taking care of your child, if not more so, because your child does need you. And as parents, we feel guilty if we can't or we don't feel well, and stop pinching off of your kids' narcotics and make the doctors know, hey, I'm sick too, and I need to be taken care of also, and just a shameless plug for family medicine physicians. The family medicine physician takes care of all ages. So if you have a primary care physician that is a family medicine physician, and I do recommend you have a physician, because it's bad enough among physicians, let alone if you try to get an advanced practitioner like an NP or PA to understand this, but get yourself a family physician that can take care of you and your child and keep you well, and don't feel guilty about it. I have up on the screen now the emergency things that can happen and the interventions we need to be thinking about. When you have trait, all of this can happen to you or to your child athlete who has trait, or your dancer, or just your active child that runs around all the time, being a normal active child. They can get a high fever. They need to be rapidly cool. Throw them in a bathtub with ice until EMS gets there. Make the EMS give them fluids. Give them water. Make people give them oxygen. You're not overreacting when your child is like, I can't move. Guess what? They can't. When they say, I can't go to soccer practice, I don't feel good, they're not being lazy. One day they're up and helping, the next day they're sleeping all the time. That's not a lazy child. If they get up and help on some days, that means they want to, so don't think your child is lazy and don't think you're lazy. This is real and it's not in your head. And get help and take care of yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Basante. We got another question. Is there anything I should worry about? I don't know if she means this, but worry about my bar. So I was bored. What hydrant the first at the hydrant?
Sorry, it's Renee. I was trying to use the voice recorder, but I'll just ask him in person. My son was born with bilateral hydronephrosis, and he has sickle cell trait.
Oh, yeah. That doesn't actually surprise me, because that is one of the 7 nephropathies of sickle cell trait. And yes, you need to be concerned about his kidneys and his hydration. And you also need to be getting him screened for renal medullary carcinoma. I would advocate once a year with him, considering he's already got insult to the injury, insult to the kidneys coming out of birth. We talked about that yesterday. I would make sure he's getting his urine dipped every 3 months for blood and protein.
Oh, wow. Okay. We live in a small town that's not really receptive to our skin color, our disease. So I'm going to have to fight for these things with my pediatrician.
And you may want to go, you may want to go to a family physician. We tend to be more open-minded. We see more things. The pediatrician mostly sees healthy kids, unless they work in the hospital. So they're not used to seeing all of these problems. And so you may want to get yourself the town family doctor instead of the town pediatrician to take care of you and your kid, and go in the gate with some of the research and let them know.
I came in late because I was on the other track. Is there something that you can send me, or is there something I can access through a website?
I would look up renal medullary carcinoma.
Okay.
Show that to them. You see that to a doctor and you say, my kid could get this, they're going to be freaking out. Like, guess what? My kid could get this. This is a complication, and it's right there on Wikipedia, or wherever. And then that will be a good starting point for saying, so look, all I'm asking you to do is just screen. I'm not asking you
would I go through his nephrologist, which we don't have currently, but
the nephrologist may be very receptive to it, because one thing a nephrologist never wants is to miss a kidney cancer.
Okay, thank you.
One final question, but I'll also just say that Miss Ritchie of the Chris Johnson Foundation is on this talk right now. The Chris Johnson Foundation is a renal medullary carcinoma support organization. They have a support group. So hopefully, Miss Ritchie, you can put your information, but Google Chris Johnson Foundation, and we are all family. The final question, with less than 60 seconds, what should I look for on blood tests?
That's a very long question. That's what I just went over. So you need to look for small changes in the red blood cell indices that I talked about on your CBC, and you need a hemoglobin electrophoresis. You can also go to my website and sign up for a consultation. My team is going to kill me because like we're not 100% ready.
Yes, that's the next thing I was gonna say. Inscription, go to get a consultation with Dr. Pasante. We are right up against the point, but also Dr. Pasante, Miss Richie Johnson, Farron, we're all on Hoover. So please, ask us the questions there. Let's continue the conversation. But we are now going over to Agios, the Lunch and Learn with Agios, one of our conference sponsors. Thank you all so much for joining the Trait Track. We'll see you guys next
Thank
year.
you.
But we'll see you over at the Agios Lunch and Learn.
Great job.
And
Thank
come
you.
listen to us on KCA Radio. We do talk about trait at least once a month.